Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. We are live on our Facebook page at the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo, and happy World Ocean Day, everyone. Thank you for being here for first live session of the day. Dr. Alex here to accompany you throughout the day. And if I can't be with our students in the water, the best place to be is to be up here today to talk to you about the ocean. So I have two fantastic guests to start the day with us today. And first, I have Dr. Robbie, curator of the Natural History Museum at BAMS. Good morning, Dr. Robbie.
Good morning, Alex. Good morning, everybody. Happy World Oceans Day.
So, I mean, when we think Natural History Museum, we think like dinosaurs and old bones and stuff. Like, do you have any ocean stuff going on in the museum?
We have lots of things going on. You can see our displays downstairs to talk about our marine environment. Upstairs, we have collections of different specimens of snails and corals and plants, both marine and terrestrial. So the museum really tries to capture all the natural history of Bermuda, and a big part of that's going to be our ocean, going to be our marine life.
All right. And I think there is a virtual peek, at the museum later on in the afternoon, so you can see exactly what Robbie is talking about.
Yeah, I've got a little story for you later on.
Yeah. Our second guest is Captain Trevor Rawson. Morning, Trevor.
Morning, Alex. Good morning, everybody. I'm here live from Trunk Island, which is, of course, surrounded by water. So I think it fits our World Oceans Day quite well.
Super. Awesome. So, Trevor, can I just ask you, like having grown in Bermuda, has the ocean always been central to you? Like, have you always been drawn to it and happy to be in it?
My family's 8 generations strong here. So we have a real tight connection with the water in Bermuda. Spent a lot of time in it as I was young. As my brother's a bit older, I learned how to swim before I could walk. So it's pretty amazing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for bringing us your love of the ocean. Awesome. So we are going to taking you guys exploring our seamounts and kind of like give you a little insight of the birth of Bermuda, of like, where we at, and let the rocks talk. So if you guys are into geology and into like, the deep, I think you are in the right spot. So I am going to get started and attempting to get into technology to share my screen with you guys, so I can take you. Yeah, that's kind of like way back, when the Earth was created. Just to make sure that everybody is aware, and I'm sure everybody is, that the Earth is made of layers, right? We have the core, then we have the mantle, that's kind of like liquidy, with the magma that's in there, and then we have the crust up there at the top, which is solid, and it is where we stand. But when we think about the crust on land, on the continent, we also have to think that there is a crust at the bottom of the ocean, right? So when you look at a map of the world, of the planet, taking into account the crust, we actually realize it's kind of like divided differently than just in continents and oceans, right? So these are what we call our tectonic plates, and it looks a little bit different, right? And some of you guys might be aware that those plates actually move. All right, so you have those plates kind of like floating, on the top of the magma, and this is what's going to create action at the surface of the surface of the ocean, at the bottom of the ocean, and at the surface of the Earth as well. So here and that's what I get when I have my touch screen and I'm trying to show you with my cursor what's going on here. So when you have like an oceanic plate that's kind of like meeting a continental plate, we have what we call like subduction, and it's going to create a lot of action. So if you have an oceanic crust meeting a continent, you create a chain of volcanoes and very active stuff. If that happens in the ocean, and if you go here to the other side, you have like an oceanic plate that's kind of like meeting another oceanic plate, and you create like we call an arc of volcanoes, right? Now, Bermuda hasn't been created like that. Bermuda is kind of like in the middle of nowhere, and Bermuda has been created by what we call the hot spot. It's one of those little spots that's really hot, and eventually you have a shield volcano that appears thanks to that hot spot. So it has created us, right? Here we are one of those like groups of seamounts in the Atlantic Ocean, but you can see here that there is more, not just us in the Bermuda Central Rise. So when did that happen? We had two volcanic episodes, like most of you might know. First one about 110 million years ago, the seamount didn't quite make it to the surface. And then again, 35 to 40 million years ago, and then we made it to the surface. We have another little seamount chain that's close to Earth, the Muir seamount chain there. We have also the Bowditch seamounts that you can see a little bit closer to us. That's actually close to our, pedestal, like we call it in Bermuda, which is made of the Bowditch seamount, of us, with the island of Bermuda, and then we have Challenger Bank and August Bank, which is also called Plantagenet. And this is what we have, very, very close to us, bringing us waters from like thousands of meters to very, very shallow reefs. So I think that's when I'm going to handle it to Dr. Robbie, because he's been part of the explorations that we've done, to better understand the deep waters and and have images of that volcanoes and the side. So Dr. Robbie, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about an expedition that happened in 2016 by the Nekton group. They came here with some really great tools, and we came here to really begin to explore both the biology and a little bit of geology in the upper parts of our seamount. So here we are on the deck of our ship, the Baseline Explorer. And this is one of the two submarines we're going to use to dive down to 300 meters, which isn't very far, considering the seamount goes down to about 4,000 meters. But it begins to give us an idea of what our upper parts of our ocean look like. So we're just going to look at one of the subs being launched here. I'm on the deck taking this picture. There are two people in that sub, and then they're going to chuck me over in the side in a minute. And so there's reasonable amount of safety that has to go into getting these machines ready so that we know they can do their job of taking us down to the bottom. So it's really pretty exciting to have this opportunity to get in and really look at what's down there, because there were some really remarkable surprises that we got here. So here I am ready to go underwater, and it's really something to get off the ship and have a chance to catch your breath and get ready to look into that blue water and head down below. So our first surprise really came when we got down to the bottom, which was the top of Plantagenet Bank. We also call it Argus Bank. It was just really flat. We had some idea of this from other explorations, and people have been doing technical diving out here for a while, but it was really featureless in some ways, except for this really amazing carpet of a type of brown algae called Sporoctus. And within this algae were just a huge host of fishes, just sitting there, coming up to see what we were doing, just feeding in the water if that's what they did. But they had to pay attention, because up here, there are a lot of predators. And here comes one of them right now. But apart from the barracuda, there's all sorts of jacks, tunas, wahoos, just congregating around the banks all the time, and fishermen have known that, and we've used that for a long time. So we're going to leave the top of the bank and go down to 300 meters. And what you're looking at just in the corner here is the slope of the seamount of Plantagenet. It looks no different than the slope of Bermuda or Bowditch Seamount or Challenger. It looks pretty featureless, but here we come in a bit closer. We're going to sort of move along the side of the volcano, so it's going up and away from you here, but there's an awful lot of biology going on down here. Some things called wire corals, are sort of long, twisty looking soft corals. There's sponges. Here's a few sea urchins. They're big, long spines, much bigger than the ones we find in shallow water. So there's a lot of life there. And as we're going along, we came across this remarkable piece of geology. This is a fossil reef. It was built by corals millions of years ago, perhaps. We don't really know. We couldn't date this. But it has just been sitting down here, being slowly eroded by storms, and it's a habitat. There are corals living on it here, fish come and aggregate on there. It was a really fantastic discovery, because what we had seen before was pretty monotonous, nice and flat, not much going on. Then this really large piece of old rock, but not volcanic rock. Here's some volcanic rocks. These are large boulders that much have been ejected and just fell onto the slope of this part of the seamount, what we call Plantagenet Bank. And you'll find similar scenes around all of Bermuda. But we're not very deep here. It's only about 300 meters. But the rocks are important because they're a habitat, things attached to it. And when things are growing there, other things are going to come in, like those jacks, which are really quite attracted to what we were doing in the submarine. So we had lots of interesting discoveries. This is one thing. There's a way off in the distance is something called a spur dog shark. It's not a great picture, but when we examine the video, which we were doing with this sub and the other sub, we got a pretty good look at it. And this was another surprise. This is another fish. It's a type of butterfly fish. We know 4 species that are common in shallow water, but this is called the French butterfly fish, and it's known from the southern part of the Caribbean. What's it doing up here? We had no record of it. You can just see it off to the side there. We saw them quite frequently. So that was a big discovery. And there were 2 other fishes that we recorded that were here. But as you see going along here, wherever there's some rock, there's something growing on it. And these wire corals are really, really very abundant. So we've moved up the slope a little bit. We're about 100 meters, so it's a little bit more light, so you can see a bit more illumination around there. And so the sub's just looking up the hill. And it doesn't look like there's very much there. You can see a lot of the volcanic rock, but when we were close in, you can see there's a lot of biology going on. And that was a really interesting discovery, is how much diversity of life we found down there. Now we're going to switch locations here. We're up off the southwest part of Bermuda, a place called Tiger Reef, it's sort of southwest of Southwest Breaker. Here's another fossil reef. It's not particularly deep here, 120 meters, but again, lots of stuff growing on here. Lots and lots of these sea fans. They're not the same sea fan we see at North Rock or on our patch reefs in our North Lagoon. These are just a different type of animals. Here's another piece of rock over here. You can see some little white branching corals there. They don't have any coloration. They're too deep. There's not enough light down here to support the plants that live in shallow water corals. All sorts of interesting things that we discovered along here. And more of these wire corals. And we're going to go underneath this one. This one's probably about 2 meters or so long, maybe even a bit longer. And what they're doing down here is they have to catch food. And as we go underneath it, you get a glimpse of the feeding structures, the tentacles of the polyps, just sitting out in the water, and the wire coral just moves around in the currents, and it just hopes to capture some plankton that are in the water there.
I'm just going to share, Robbie, that someone watching us on Facebook just said like they thought they were fishing lines. So thank you for explaining, what those little things were. So yeah.
Now we did see a little bit of fishing gear here and there, but not too much. But what we're just looking at right here are a group of boulders that we call rhodoliths, and they're formed by algae over a long period of time. And here comes something. Watch this lionfish come in here. You can see all the small fish that were there just move out of the way. That other fish seems a little less perturbed, probably not really on the lionfish's menu. So this lionfish was down at about 120 meters. We did see a lionfish down to 300 meters. That was really surprising, but we've known that from the rest of the Caribbean. So now we're going to switch up to slightly shallower reefs to sort of finish our story about what our reefs are doing and tie it back to geology. These are what we call our mesophotic reefs. There's not very much light here at 45 meters, enough to sort of see, but really not enough to really sustain the growth of all the shallow water corals we have that you would see around North Rock. There are many other soft corals, again, doing the same thing, trying to capture plankton from the water. Some of them do have the algae that allow them some photosynthesis to come into those corals to benefit them. But there's still lots going on here. There's a small school of bonitas. These fish seem to love the submarines. They're cruising past us, and lots of stuff in the water column. This is really an interesting discovery. It's not an uncommon feature, but this is a type of branching coral, and the lights are going to come on in a sec, and you can have a look at this branching coral called Madrasis. And it's sort of a little island of activity. There's quite a few fishes here, some juvenile parrotfishes. Didn't expect to see them down at 45 meters. They're much more common in shallow water, but they're using it. So in all, the Nekton really allowed us to discover a lot more about the diversity of life on our reefs and how much deeper it goes. And it's not the same everywhere, and it definitely changes as you go down deep. So what you look at here, when you look at these reefs here, this is really the beginning of the accumulation of coral. So even though there's not much live coral there right now, they're growing on corals that had been growing there when sea level was a lot lower all through the ice ages. And we come into our shallow water, we look at our typical brain corals and other things that we have here. I think that's going to come up in a sec, Alex.
Did something happen? No.
Okay, well, we're just going to, but Alex will show you a picture in a sec about our shallow water reefs. And you have to think about these shallow water reefs as a place where carbonate material coming from the skeletons of corals, shells, bivalves just accumulates over lots and lots of long periods of time. Over the last million years, this process has been going on, and all this carbonate material ends up being, broken down by wave energy and also by parrotfishes. And when that happens, it creates the sand that makes our beaches. But that's where Bermuda comes from. That's the geology part here. As beautiful as reefs are, with all the different forms of life there, we really enjoy. It's the accumulation of all the broken down pieces of those reefs into sand material that creates a supply of sand that's going to be blown up into dunes and solidified into the rock that makes our island. So without the reef to make the sand, we don't have a Bermuda. So the geology is just as important to think about the hard rocks that the volcano has that, are sort of the place where all the shallow water reefs have been able to grow over the last million years to allow for the accumulation of the carbonates that ends up being piled up into dunes. And I think we're at a point where we're probably not going to see the slides that we want, but that's really what the story is going to transition from here, is the fact that, our shallow reefs are really important. When sea levels are relatively high, a lot of reef grows at the level we have right now. And as sea level has receded over time, all that sand material is exposed and blown up into dunes. And as I said earlier, this becomes part of the story about why we have a Bermuda. And now we're going to switch over to my colleague, Trevor Rawson. We're going to sort of look at how the sand ended up being formed into the various dunes that make up our island. That didn't happen all at once. It happened in many different episodes over the last million years. So Trevor, let's go have a look and explore some of our rocks and do it from a marine perspective.
Thank you, Robbie. And before you handle it over to Trevor, I had one of the comments saying like, "Oh, I didn't know we had a sub." So I just want you to just confirm that sub is. Where is it now? It's not owned by.
Well,
Bermuda, right?
there were two subs. So I was in one, and you can see the other sub. And right now, Nekton has been busy and transitioned their operation to the Indian Ocean. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, they've had to cancel all their field programs in the Indian Ocean this year. But I talked to my colleagues at Nekton, and they're really glad that we're able to bring the story back into focus of what they accomplished here. So no, we don't have our own sub. They're not that difficult to get. They're not that complicated. These subs were actually developed for private use. There's a lot of people who have super yachts and they want to have their own sub, and there's a company in Florida that builds them. But these were used for science, and they were a lot of coordination and funding needed to make that happen. But we try to take advantage of when people say, "Hey, we got something that's a useful tool." We say, "Please come here. We'll find a way to support your ideas, because we will gain new information that helps us understand more about what we have in our waters, and we can do a better job of conserving it and showcasing it."
Absolutely. So before I let you go, we've had a debate going on the Facebook page, and guys, please put your questions, put your comments. Some of those fish where you said they were bonitas, we're having a heated discussion saying that they had a black stripe across their face and they were probably jacks. So can you confirm they were bonitas?
Bonitas are jacks. So
there we go. So it's always good to answer and to just debate.
As much as I think I know everything about natural history, I'm quite prepared to be wrong from time to time, but I'm pretty sure bonitas are jacks.
All right, so that was
to get the questions out there. We learned something.
Facebook. So thank you, Robbie, and I'm going to attempt. And as you see, I've been having a couple of technical difficulties. It's not as easy as it seems. So I can let Trevor in and roll his video.
Thank you, Robbie, for all that. I appreciate it. It leads perfectly into what we're about to talk about. So just so everybody knows, we're not going to dive straight into the geology. I'm going to give you a little bit of a ride through Flats. Some people might not have had a chance to go through Flats Bridge, so off we go. In the background there, you can see the Endurance, which is, of course, sponsored by Sampo International, and our other boat, Callista. So these are both vessels owned by BZS and sponsored by Sampo and the Sempo Foundation, and fueled by Rubis. And that's what helps us make all these things happen. You can see our bus in the background, and of course, the aquarium. So off we go off here to Flats. And you can really see straight off the bat, there's quite a bit of current. And if you've ever been down to Flats, you might have seen it yourself. But coming through it, you need quite a bit of propulsion. So we're on one of our other vessels that BZS has that we can take into smaller, tighter areas, which we'll get to see a little bit later. But as we come through here, you can see all this current passing through. So Flats has, Harrington Sound, as we're entering here, has a slight delay in our tidal flow. So if you can imagine, as the tide goes out around Bermuda, it takes time for the water to flow out of Harrington Sound, because it goes through Flats Inlet. Here is our only above water exit. and throughout all the caves that surround Harrington Sound, which we're famous for. So if you look in the water here, it can actually be quite clear this time of year because there's a bit less phytoplankton as you would see in the summer, usually due to the amount of sunlight that hits the ocean surface, which of course fuels the phytoplankton. So as we get in here, there's a lot of unique species that live in Harrington Sound because of all this change of water. And there's a lot of filter feeders like sponges and of course bivalves, which are in the clam family and mussel family, which some of the ones in Harrington Sound here have the ability to eat into the rock. And as we come up a little closer to the rock edge here, if you look down towards the lower part of the tide line there, you can see it's a bit of a notch. This is known as a bioerosional notch. Bio meaning done by organisms, and erosion obviously means eroding, so breaking down of the rock. So as they eat into the rock, this rock line can extend further into the rock itself and go back as far as almost 2 meters. And this, of course, leads to the structural integrity of the rock being destroyed. And then, of course, these boulder falls come straight off. So if you have a house in Harrington Sound, it could be a little bit treacherous, but of course, a lot of people tend to reinforce. So it's just lets you understand how the erosion works in Harrington Sound. And of course, water being one of the major drivers of erosion happens all around Harrington Sound. So what we're going to do is going to cruise straight across over to our eastern portion of Harrington Sound to see a cross section of what our dune formations would look like. But as we cruise around, just keep in mind one of the major processes that happens globally, and that's glaciation. So there's a point in which the glaciers actually freeze and it lowers all the water available in our entire atmosphere. And that would drop our water line down about 350 feet. And this would allow for more of Bermuda to be exposed and allow for more sand dune formation. So the coral reef, of course, breaks down with all the different fish and erosion processes underwater, but that allows for sand to be developed. And that sand then gets blown up off the shoreline and onto the shore itself. And then vegetation is able to grow and put root systems all throughout the dune, as you might see on places like Horseshoe Bay and all the way along down to Warwick Long Bay. And that vegetation is able to hold the sand in place, and then the rain takes over from there and allows rain to percolate or move down through the rock from the surface down throughout and depositing little bits of salts and calcium and, of course, melding the rock together. Some areas like Walsingham Jungle, you might even see it's very hard, but we'll get into that when we get a little closer. So the main thing you can see is there are different timelines that this would have happened. So Bermuda's been through about 8 separate geological epochs where these major geological events of glaciation were to happen, which allowed for different formations of rocks. So as we get a closer look at the rock here, right about the center of your screen, you can almost see that there are 2 different shapes of the rock. Horizontal strata is what you normally see as sedimentary rock, where the rock can actually compress against itself and make horizontal lines. But if you look at the lower rock, you can see it's one angle. And as you go up the side of the cliff face, you can see it's a different angle. These are 2 different timelines, all right? And the lower one is usually the oldest. Boulder falls tend to be one of the major things that happen. So sometimes there's younger rock down low, but sometimes in between there are softer rocks, which allow for further erosion underneath harder rock. And then the harder rock falls off. So as we look at the top right-hand side of your screen, you can see 3 separate layers of rock. So the top one is Upper Townhill Formation at about 280,000 years ago. The next one down is Lower Townhill Formation at about 350,000 years ago. And the lowest one is our Walsingham Rock. And that Walsingham Rock is just below, if you look on the right side of your screen, you see a red line approaching. That red line separates those 2 layers. The oldest one is about 1.2 million years old, and that's our Walsingham Rock. But that red line is very important. That is one of our first instances where actual soil was on land on top of Bermuda, and there would have been all sorts of life going on, such as snails, birds, even skinks around that area as well. And that just shows paleosoil, which is, of course, paleo for fossil and soil being the soil layer that's there. And we have a few of those around Bermuda, but few are as obvious as this layer that you can see here. So now that we've talked a little bit about how it forms, let's go in to see what some of these erosion processes look like. So we're about to enter into Shark Hole here. And this is an area down in the northeastern portion of Harrington Sound. And as you enter into Shark Hole, one thing is very obvious, and that is quite large. And this type of erosion isn't 100% due to the bioerosion we talked about before, but it's actually due to hydraulic action, which is waves being pushed up into the cave, and it compresses air. Oh, there's a green heron that just flew out of the cave, so he's very comfortable making this area home. So one thing that's really obvious is the colors, right? So if you look down into the water, you see the crystal clear blues, and then onto the rock area there, you can see a lot of the algae coloration. So there's a lot of purples in here and a little bit of reds and some of the green. So this is obviously due to a lot of the amount of sunlight that can reach in here. So the phytoplankton is a lot less. In the back of Shark Hole there, you can actually see some of our Walsingham rock as well, which is very, very solid and usually looks a bit crystalline from all the years of precipitation penetrating through the rocks and depositing calcium, and of course, changing the rock formation just a bit. So as we exit, one thing to really look out for is some of the fish that live in here, because even though it's a little less sunlight reaching, fish are still allowed to live, are able to live in here. But as we exit the cave, look at the color of the rock change, right? So all the algae that's on the outside of the rock is able to get a bit more sunlight out here and turn a bit greener than the purples we just saw inside. You can see a little bit of coral spawn on the surface there. This is the right time of year for corals to be spawning and trying to locate an area to latch onto in order to start a whole new coral polyp and hopefully a whole new coral colony. So as we leave here down in Shark Hole, just keep that in mind that some of these erosion processes happen all over the place. And some of these caves can go way back into the hillsides, right? But there's also a bit of a change in the type of water that comes in and out of the cave. So if it's pulling out of the cave at low tide, you may find there's a bit more salinity. Now this is over Dingles Bay. Okay, so Dingles Bay has much harder rock. One thing that's very obvious is the lack of cliff fall here. So if you look in the water, you might see one big cliff fall, but that is it. All around the edge of Dingles Bay, it's extremely hard rock, and it does not allow for as many cliff falls or as much erosion. So it's very different from the areas we just had a look at. So now we're going to jam over to Abbott's Cliff. So if you never had a chance to see Abbott's Cliff in the water, it's extremely impressive. It's a very tall dune. And now with all these glacial processes happening around the world, when the water level changes, right now we're in what you know as an interglacial period. So the glaciers have melted a bit more and they allow for a lot more water in the atmosphere. And right now our prevailing wind comes from the south or southwest, right? So that prevailing wind pushes a lot of the sand up onto our southern dunes. But if the water level was drained out, that might change the air and water currents and cause the air currents to push in from the north, allowing our prevailing winds to come from the north. Now that would push up onto the North Dune. And that North Dune is what you see on Abbott's Cliff. So that would be, you can see it's very high off in the distance over by Napton Hill. But over here at Abbott's Cliff, it towers up and over. And it's got very similar rock line as you saw in one of our earlier slides and one of our earlier portions of the video. At the top there, you see yet again the Upper Town Hill Formation, which is of course quite hard. And then the Lower Town Hill Formation just below that, which is a bit softer. And that softness of the Town Hill Formation there allows for a bit more of erosion. So in that white patch you might have seen, that is actually eroding back a little further. And that again causes these cliff falls. And right ahead of you there, it might not be as obvious against the tree line, but there's Cockroach Island, which is of course famous for not having cockroaches on it. And that area is actually formed a little bit differently from our generic island formation of sedimentary rock, where you see these horizontal lines that you see up at Abbott's Cliff again. And this is formed by cliff fall. So that cliff fall would have fallen right off, and it would have been quite a large drastic change to the cliff face there. So you can see a dip in the top of the horizon line there. And that would have rolled out and landed out in the ocean. So we're just going to look back at Abbott's Cliff now, so you get a feel for exactly how tall this cliff is. If you look at that white patch that's there again, you can see it's a little bit concave. If you're out offshore there, you can actually shout towards Abbott's Cliff, roll up the water and up and over and back to you, causing a beautiful echo, which is of course a geological acoustic thing, which is pretty amazing. So as we get a little closer here, you can see there's a lot of skeleton trees. If you're not familiar with our endemic trees in Bermuda, these are the Bermuda cedars. You can see just how dense the forest there is, and it would have been all totally locked in there. And this was kind of what gave an example of pre-colonial Bermuda. being so difficult to come down from the cliff face because of the steepness and climbing up into that area, there's a lot of poison ivy. So this area was left alone for all of Bermuda's human existence, of all of our human history. And this allowed for David Wingate to get a prime example of what Nonsuch should be based around, as there's a lot of native plants here. But Cockroach Island, which is directly in front of us here, you can see there's all different shapes to the rock formations here. Some are horizontal, some are vertical, some are on different angles. And these, of course, are very unsorted material, showing us that this was a rock fall at some point. So it's pretty amazing. You can actually get behind Cockroach Island, as we're doing right now, and get a good look at some of the nature that's back here. And it was restored once by the Audubon Society to allow for any birds to live here pretty happily. As you just saw, one of our ducks, mallards, which is could be visiting or could be living here, but they aren't native to Bermuda, but they're compatible with our native environment. And you can really see that density in the tree line there. Some of these trees that look a little bit dead and gone, they're actually still alive. They're a white stopper, but that one directly in front of us there, and the one in front of us again now, those are invasive trees. The casuarina, which everybody is very familiar with, and the Indian laurel tree, which cause a lot of the habitat loss to a lot of these native birds down here. So you can see the comparison between the cedar on your left and the casuarina on your right. And those treat the rock line a little differently. So we're gonna head out of Abbott's Cliff here and head on over to an area known as Green Bay, or Green Bay Cave. So Flats Bridge allows for about 50% of the tidal flow of Harrington Sound, but there is still another 50% that needs to move out. And a lot of that moves through the caves. And so these cave systems can go all the way over to different portions of the island. And this one goes over to North Shore. So this takes quite a bit of tidal flow. And at certain tides, you can see a little bit of the upwelling as it comes in from the outside shores. But this cave isn't as much above water as it is below the waterline. So you can dive this cave if you're a professional spelunker and dive down into the cave and see how far it goes. And obviously, a lot of our marine scientists have had a chance to do this. But of course, it's a very dangerous excursion as you're going down underneath large stalactites that are always subject to movement if you knock into them, which could be very dangerous if you're inside there. But you get a good look here at what some of the stalactites on the outer cave would look like. And notice it's very different from Shark Hole, which had no stalactites dangling from the surface, as it's subject to a lot of our south winds being on the east side of Harrington Sound. And over here, this is a very protected little bay, and these stalactites are able to stay quite comfortably. So it's a beautiful place to be, and longtails nest all in here. So thank you very much for listening in, and I'm going to hand it back over to Alex to hear about some of the questions we may have on Facebook. Thank you for tuning in.
Yes, indeed. There is many questions that came in as you were talking, but you were on a roll. Amazing images, amazing explanations. So I didn't want to interrupt. So I've at least picked up 2 questions. And you probably have 2 different versions of the answer to that question. Why is Shark's Hole called Shark's Hole?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'm going to say, from what I've understood from talking to a lot of people that lived in Harrington Sound, just like Devil's Hole was a place to store fish at one given point in time, I heard that they used to rope off or fence off Shark's Hole to store some of the sharks, which would have been for a shark hash community that would have been eating that at the time. So you go out and catch sharks, and in order, we had no fridges at one point, so a good place to store lobsters and rockfish and other shark and things we'd eat would be in places like Shark's or Devil's Hole.
I see Robbie smiling. What do you think? Because I know it's like Bermuda, right? Different stories, different.
I don't know. That's an interesting story, but I think any fisherman's going to catch a shark is going to think long and hard about having to drag that shark back to put it in the cage in order to get the hash. So it's a nice idea, but I don't think that's the reality of it. I don't have any cultural history about that area. I don't know how it got its name.
All right. One of the ones I've heard, and it's maybe connected to the one that that Trevor was just explaining, is that there was like some kind of a slaughterhouse like close by, and there was blood dripping down, and somehow there was blood coming in the water and like little rejects of different kinds, and sharks would be attracted by that. So that's something I've heard. So.
Wouldn't surprise me at some point in our 400 years of history, somebody caught a shark there, and therefore it was called Shark Hole for the rest of the time.
Well, if you guys know why, or if you have ideas, or if you've heard something, get that discussion going on to Facebook, because we're probably going to learn something, or just having fun talking about it. Yeah. Second question was, why is Walsingham Rock called Walsingham Rock? I mean, the layer that you said was called Walsingham.
I'm going to hand that one over to Robbie. I actually don't know why it's.
I live down in Bailey's Bay, and I was recently reading the National Trust book about all the properties in there, which Walsingham was a very old property. So I think when geologists began to think about it, there's so much of that rock only found in that location that was the easiest label, because the house Walsingham was already there. So they said, well, there's all this rock, and it's generally found and exposed here. There's so many wonderful caves there you can see when you poke around there. That they just took the easiest thing. Well, we'll just call that Walsingham Rock because that's the name of the house that was there.
Follow suit with most Bermudian things. Why are longtails called longtails? Why are green turtles called green turtles?
Yeah, why complicate things?
Yeah,
exactly. But the other things you were talking about, Trevor, the names are things like the different layers. We have Upper Town Hill and Lower Town Hill. That's because as geologists put together the map, and one of them was a Bermudian geologist, Dr. Mark Rowe, helped construct our idea of all these patterns that we have of these different layers. Again, you took examples from Town Hill to say, okay, well, we can see these layers because we have a quarry right there in Town Hill, up in Lawley's Well Road. They've been quarrying away there, so it reveals all those patterns. So for geologists to take advantage of rock cuts and quarries and begin to map out all different layers, they just picked, a location. Town Hill, Walsingham were simple names to apply to help them construct the story that we have to try to understand, to share with younger people.
Just while you're on the subject of Town Hill as well, I do understand that Town Hill is our peak, right, at about 75 meters above sea level, just so people have that in mind. That's how far the sand dunes were able to blow up in Bermuda.
Yep, and we know a lot about the history, because as opposed to a place like Hawaii where their volcanoes form and they eventually sink over time, Bermuda's volcano kind of stayed put pretty much. It may have bounced around up and down a little bit because of how glaciers affect the continent of the U.S. affects the stability of the crustal plate we're sitting on. So if you load a glacier on North America, it kind of forces up Bermuda. You take the glacial weight off North America, and then we sink down again. So we don't understand that perfectly, but we have a general feeling that Bermuda has been pretty stable. So we can see evidence of sea level well above current sea level today at about 2 meters, about 7 meters, and some evidence from 22 meters that we can find in the government quarry that you can see very clear evidence of marine deposits that are not storm debris. And that just reflects massive loss of ice from both poles plus glaciers to have raised sea level that much. So I don't know when we're going to see that again, but those deposits are really evident. They really show the value of Bermuda and understanding changes in sea level and also how quickly they've changed over time. So some story around Upper Town Hill and Lower Town Hill, it was in the same glacial stage, but the pattern of glaciation and deglaciation varied quite a bit. So it didn't all melt at the same time. It didn't all freeze at the same time, but over the 40, 50, 60,000 years of time, it eventually got warmer and eventually got colder. So that allows us to understand some of the dynamics of glaciation and deglaciation, and we're in a very warm phase right now. We have to be very concerned about the predicted rises of sea level, and Bermuda is useful for understanding that story.
Thank you. So before I let you go, guys, because I think we're getting a little bit over time, Northlands Primary is watching, and you may have mentioned it, Trevor, but did you mention it why it was called Cockroach Island?
I believe, from what I understand, it's called Cockroach Island, just like everything else is called it. It called different names in Bermuda. If you go on top of Abbott's Cliff, before they did any culling, it would have looked like a cockroach from above, just like Rabbit Island. To some people, it looks like a rabbit from the side.
All right. Thank you for sharing that.
Not due to all the massive cockroaches on it.
No, definitely not for the cockroaches. I have another one for you, Robbie. Do you have to decompress after being in the sub? So going back to your first segment.
No, because the pressure in the sub is the same as atmospheric pressure, so there's no issues with respect to diving there. It's it's a tight space. You're a little uncomfortable. You're glad to get up. We would be in there for 4 to 5 hours. There's not a whole lot of movement in there, so it's not uncomfortable. It's air conditioned and the water's cool around there. So you actually, if you want to stay longer, you actually bring some warm clothes to put on there. but no, we didn't have any issues with respect to diving. It's a good machine. It does its job very well.
No, thank you. We're going to have a session with Dr. Gretchen Goodbody Gringley later on in this afternoon, talking about lionfish, and she's going to talk about tech diving, and it's a whole different ballgame. So,
well,
yeah, there is there might be a couple of other questions, rolling in on the page. So Trevor and Robbie, if you don't mind checking the Facebook page and maybe answering some of your questions when you have a moment, because I don't think we can answer them all, that would be amazing. And if you guys are watching us again later on, put your questions, put your comments, and we will try to do our best to answer them. There's been some cool information shared. I haven't had time to really look at them, but like some old information from the Atlas and the Gazetteers. So I think we might learn a few things by looking what people are sharing. So
just before you go, Alex, I did get an update from our other captain, Nigel at BZS.
Yeah.
A shark hole before we get going.
There we go. So please.
Is that shark hole, blah, blah, blah. Perhaps the sharks made their way through the layer in the honeycomb of underwater caverns and tunnels, which are said to riddle the isthmus between Harrington Sound and the sea. Sharks are eaten in Bermuda, especially appreciated by St. David Islanders and so on. So it looks like they might have been making their way through the caverns or even in through Harrington Sound, and they might have been sighted, just like Robbie had said, that would lead, at least one sighting might name that area.
It's very important, interesting that you mentioned that, because Jennifer Gray did chime in and saying like, yeah, it used to be inhabited by numerous nurse sharks. So they're back in the days when they were abundant. And another question was like, how do sharks get into Harrington Sound? So that answers that question too. They can go through the caverns. They can go, there's Flat Bridge as well. So there is
the bridge.
yeah, there are connections, right? You can get into Harrington Sound. So thank you very much, gentlemen. We are going to let you go about your days. We might see some of you again today. Robbie's back on at 4:30, and actually right now, when you guys get off this session, I think he's taking us on a virtual tour of the aquarium as well, so you can log in onto that and enjoy a virtual tour of the aquarium. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a great
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you, Alan.
everybody. Sharks with Choi at 12 o'clock.